let me just say a few words by way of introduction to some of the conceptual issues that we hope that we'll be tackling together with you over the next 12 hours or so. First of all, to acknowledge that I do not have conflicts of interest, financial or otherwise, in this area, except like most citizens, I'm conflicted about many of these issues, but you'll hear more about that in just a moment. What I want to touch on very briefly by way of introduction are what we might mean by radicalization, at least to open up that question. You'll hear many different ways of coming at these issues by the participants. And a few words about what some of the social dynamics of radicalization and extremism may be in our current moment. And part of that orientation is to insist that we have to understand our focus on individual acts of terrorism or individual life trajectories that seem to go, take a sharp turn and veer off in a direction that's alarming and worrisome to other people. We have to understand that against the larger backdrop of social forces going on both locally and globally that seem to be intensifying fractiousness and conflict between different ethnic, religious, cultural groups through processes that seem to polarize people's identities and create feelings, very strong feelings of us and them. And that we need to understand that as best we can if we want to get at both some of the causal processes that we might want to intervene in to try to reduce the frequency of these events, and if we want to understand their impact on people's lives, because one of the themes that we'll be hearing throughout today is the way in which, although our focus is on sort of the alarming acts of certain individuals, there is a much wider group of people, really all of us, who are seriously impacted on by these events, and maybe that's where we can sometimes make the most differences in terms of limiting the repercussions of catastrophic events that are disrupting our societies and our youth's prospects for the future. We're particularly interested in what the perspectives of cultural psychology, cultural psychiatry can offer to this discussion, to this debate. We think we have some important things to say, partly because, as you'll hear, coming at this as clinicians who understand a little bit about people's life narratives and individual struggles, we can provide a unique perspective on understanding the intersecting forces that influence a person's course of action, partly because by working with vulnerable communities, we have a strong sense of the echoes of these events in people's lives, and we can bring that to the fore, since that tends to get, one thing that tends to get hidden and pushed aside in the face of dramatic acts of violence. We also have, working in the area of cultural psychiatry, a commitment and long engagement with efforts to build bridges with communities and to be in dialogue with different ethnocultural minority communities. And again, as you'll hear, particularly toward the end of the day, that's a vital aspect of any kind of vision of prevention or protection or reduction of the frequency of violence in our communities. As I said, I think it's extraordinarily important to keep the larger context in mind. We began planning this meeting about a year ago, and political events have overtaken us and made these questions even more salient, even more urgent for all of us. We're living in a time of extreme political polarization, of the rise of right-wing extremism in ways that we've not seen for many decades, and of a kind of sanctioning of the use of anger and hostility and othering in politics in a way that was not acceptable in previous moments and previous regimes. So speaking back to that in some way to create situations of dialogue, of striving toward mutual understanding, of tolerating difference in some ways is really an urgent matter. And I think all of us are concerned about this again, and both as citizens and as practitioners and researchers engaged with these issues. My title is just a kind of an evocative way of pointing out that we're dealing with some basic tensions in the psyche and in community, the tendency for all of us to engage in kind of polarized thinking in some ways, to see the world as presenting us with mutually strong but incompatible alternatives, and demanding that we somehow find ways to negotiate that. And this context of extreme polarization and a heightened sense of anxiety, of danger and so on, is leading to the erosion of those hard-won civil institutions that have allowed us to be aware of and to some degree protect vulnerable groups and populations. So it's a major concern that the context of threat that is constantly maintained to serve the interests both of those engaged in terrorism and those engaged with politically extremist agendas serves to legitimate a kind of process of silencing of vulnerable individuals and indeed a kind of occlusion or eclipse of human rights activities that, again, as I say, were very hard won. Many of them emerged over the course of a tragic history of the last century, and it seems now 50 years, 60 years, 70 years after the Second World War that some of the things we achieved with things like refugee rights and so on are under very serious attack. So that's another aspect of the discussion you'll be hearing today, is trying to think through the ways in which certain styles of rhetoric, certain ways of framing our current dilemmas are being used in some way, sometimes deliberately, sometimes inadvertently, to erode these very vital social institutions that are among our few contributions toward building a global civil society. So as you've heard, we're working at the intersection then of some very important mental health and clinical issues and some very broad, the broadest indeed, political and social issues. And in talking about radicalization, one thing we want to emphasize throughout is that taking an extreme position on something is not inherently bad. The creation of new ideas, the creation of new culture, in a sense, occurs precisely at that interface. The issue really of concern for all of us is extreme positions and radicalization that lead toward violence, which then, of course, forecloses any future dialogue and conversation between peoples and tends to further polarize the situation. Now, as I said, I think cultural psychiatry has some particular contributions to make, and one is to disentangle the potential role of mental health problems and at the intersection between mental health issues and people's cultures and communities, because this is an everyday challenge for us in working with diverse clients. And also to look at the broader social processes of marginalization, of disempowerment, of inequality, of humiliation that is part of the emotional fuel, if you will, of some of the processes that we'll be talking about. And again, our unique position at the intersection of psychology, psychiatry, social sciences gives us potentially something to say about these issues in a somewhat different way, hopefully in a somewhat more integrative way than sometimes happens when people are advancing a sort of unicausal explanation that's driven very much by their discipline or by their political position and so on. And we're also preeminently concerned, because many of us are working with youth from communities that are being marginalized or targeted in some ways as being the sort of the vector of danger in Western societies and so on. Many of us are very concerned with how to foster health and resilience among those youth so that we have a positive future for them and indeed for all of society, rather than what seems to be unfortunately happening at times, which is that efforts to solve the problem, as it were, end up creating more polarization, more insult and injury to vulnerable groups, and therefore perhaps inadvertently fuel the fire that we're trying to put out. There is indeed a real problem. This is not simply a matter of media over-reporting or sensationalizing and so on. There is a dynamic going on globally of increased terrorist attacks, increased political violence in some forms. Here's a slide just showing some of that overall trend and emphasizing, as this slide does, that where most of these attacks are occurring, of course, is not in the West, even though events in the West always garner the greatest news representation. And, we count heads assiduously when it's a North American or a U.S. person who died, and when it's something that happened somewhere else, we get a vague statistic and no faces, no names, no details. So there's definitely a sense that's promulgated by the Western media that all lives don't matter equally in some ways. And I think that's part of the problem in terms of people's consciousness and their ways of thinking about these issues. So it's important to keep that perspective in mind, although we don't have, and unfortunately won't have today at this meeting, proper representation of this diversity in terms of voices from Africa or enough voices from the Middle East or other places in the world, South Asia and so on, and Indonesia and other places where people are facing similar issues. In addition to being more frequent acts, many of those acts don't result in deaths or result in a small number of deaths, but there have been events that have caused large numbers of deaths and that have been, in effect, both the increasing number of events and the scale of events is driving up the total of people dying. I think you can also see in this kind of a map or other kinds of graphs where people plot the major political events and interventions that the strategies that people have chosen up till now, waging war on terror, which seems again like a category error because it's not an army that you're fighting, it's a social process that is very diffuse and has many different facets to it, that those strategies for the most part are not working or are even doing the work of the terrorists by disrupting civil society in ways. And that's a major concern for us, the ways in which the political use of securitization is serving to undermine civil society in ways that actually serve the needs both of a global oligarchic economic elite and of those who deliberately intend to disrupt some of the everyday life in wealthy societies. There are changes going on, and again, this will not be a major focus of our discussion, but it will be part of the backdrop of what we're talking about. There are changes going on in who is involved in perpetrating these events, and here you can see the enormous increase in right-wing extremism, and it's a reason why in our title for this meeting we're including both radicalization and extremism, because the words are used slightly differently to cover only partially overlapping groups of people, but we're talking about perhaps some of the same processes or at least mirror images of processes, and that will be one of the things we'll be talking about. Another important element in this is the extent to which people involved in taking violent action are parts of communities or groups who have that avowed purpose and goal, or in some sense are acting on their own, although it's rare that even people acting on their own have not been influenced by all the different kinds of violent rhetoric that's circulating. It does seem that there are individuals who do not have a long history of social participation in a group, who've not gone through that deliberate sort of induction into a group, but who are oriented or further agitated by information that's available on the internet and other places, but whose behavior is also, in those cases, perhaps influenced by their mental health problems. So the rise of those lone actors, if you will, is an important part of the picture that we're talking about. One of the things that we need to sort of push back against, and I hope that you'll see over the day a kind of gradually more refined and more multi-causal, more many-layered kind of account of what's going on, is the tendency to see these scenarios in very simplistic terms. And so I'll just say very briefly, I think the two dominant styles of talking about these events are in terms of individual agents who have somehow gone off track, either because they are suffering from a mental health problem, they're sort of, they're mad or crazy in colloquial terms, and that explains their violent actions, or they're simply evil, and the word evil explains their actions. That is, they're just people who want to do very bad things for whatever, morally wrong reasons. So that's a kind of everyday rhetoric that gets used a lot, and it's part of what we need to, again, unpack and think about in a more sophisticated way. The other common account, which is very important for all these discussions, is that what we're really facing is what Samuel Huntington some years ago called a clash of civilizations, that we have Western civilizations that are committed to pluralism and democracy and peaceful civil society, and then we have proselytizing fundamentalist religions and other extreme political positions that have a more apocalyptic view, that have a view of pushing towards some kind of global transformation of society in a way that expresses their ideals, but then does not allow space for for coexistence with other groups. So this is a particular way of drawing the picture. It's grossly oversimplified, and typically what happens is the group that is anxiously and angrily typifying the other group paints it in very broad strokes, so we end up with a very polarized and misleading picture of what's going on. So I think you'll hear quite a bit from people who know a lot about these things about nuancing that picture of what is it that's at stake at a social and political level in terms of these discussions. I think the final thing I'll say, because I'm going to be on track by finding a way to come to a quick close here, is that in the discussions that we'll be having today, you will hear a variety of levels of explanation and people coming from different disciplines, people who focused on different aspects of the problem. And we need some way of putting those things together, because this is, even though the temptation is to try to explain individual action in terms of choices people are making, there certainly are very large social forces at play that people are living at the intersections of. And we have to find a conceptual language and a way for putting all that together. So here's a very simple but I think helpful scheme coming from Weber and Kruglanski, who suggests that we think about the process of radicalization and violent terrorism and radicalization to violence in terms of three sort of intersecting or cyclical processes. One set of which are centered on individual factors, on the needs of individuals, their vulnerability and their motivations to stabilize an identity, their perceptions of threats to their identity and the environment, their efforts to stabilize those things, and all that we can bring to bear, and you'll hear a number of perspectives this morning from psychology, even from biology, to understanding vulnerable individuals. And then we have those individual sort of levels of explanation being influenced heavily by particular kinds of discourse, particular stories, particular narratives that are circulating in the world and that offer us ways of framing problems in the world. They suggest, here's what's really going on. The Clash of Civilizations would be an example of a narrative that does circulate in many different forms. Or the typification of a certain group in terms of us and them is, again, a kind of narrative or story, a way of ascribing identity and talking about difference. And these things are quite powerful and galvanizing for people, and are part of the process then of capitalizing on individual vulnerability and amplifying that process. And finally, the thing that is perhaps most distinctive, both of these things I've just talked about have been with us, throughout human history in different forms. The unique thing now is this, the motive force and the medium through which people form networks and become part of a community, part of a group that has a particular ideology, a particular plan or program, and are then able to push that forward in some ways. So one very distinctive feature of the contemporary problem, and part of what may account for its speed and acceleration and its growth, are the use of the internet and telecommunications and social media, which are allowing people to come together in like-minded groups in ways that would have been impossible in the past. That is to say, people can reach out across the globe to find people who share similar disaffections, similar concerns, and they can feel that they belong in a very active way. They can have very personalized messages that are given to them. They can participate in a very regular way in a community. And this process of forming communities, forming networks, and then amplifying certain ways of thinking. It's always existed on a small scale, but we now have ways that this can break out of the bounds of local geography and with an intensity and with a rapidity that has never really existed before. And I think that's one, if you want to look at what are the new features, technologically anyway, this is one of the important new features. We could argue there are other things going on politically, economically, and so on in this moment in history that help to account for the intensity of what we're facing, but I think that's an important set of issues.